Right now, what I'd like you to do is to close your eyes and walk back with me 33 years to 1986. My daughter is 7. Her younger brother will soon turn 5. They have decided to sell lemonade on the street we live on in the small community of Cambridge, where we lived for 11 years. We lived on a street on the edge of town where few cars traveled. The sign they created to sell their lemonade stated the most important aspect: lemonade, 5 cents. But the E is larger than the capital L, and the M is in uppercase. All other letters are lowercase. The last part of the word lemonade curves downward because the artist ran out of room on her poster board. Norman Rockwell would have loved it. My 2 children sit on the side of an underutilized crossroad of life. They sit behind a small table with little chairs behind them. My daughter, being the older, is the cashier. She monitors very closely the plastic bowl of change. My son, he's the worker bee. He's the waiter. He handles the melting ice. He pours the drinks. He stacks and restacks and rearranges the paper cups over and over and over again. Behind them on the family porch is Dad, proud of his children, smiling as he witnesses his children's inauguration into capitalism. Business has been slow but steady. The summer afternoon stream of customers, who happen to all be our neighbors, wanted to support my children in their endeavor. Part of our marketing strategy was me calling up several of our neighbor families, inviting them to stop to the grand opening of the lemonade stand. And towards the end of the afternoon, the pitcher of warm lemonade is reaching that syrupy bottom of nearly empty. The bottom of the plastic bowl has 35 cents in change. They've made 7 sales. Not bad for 3 hours' work. With the exception of a few spills, I think the service has been exceptional. There hasn't been one complaint, not one. I was proud of my children. I leaned back in my lawn chair. I closed my eyes. I continued to listen to the Minnesota Twins lose again in their worst year of baseball ever. That was 1986. And then it happened. I heard a voice that I did not recognize. "I'll have a cup of lemonade, please." I opened my eyes. It was a real customer. I mean, a real customer. An unsolicited neighbor who had driven by and seen the sign, stopped and ordered a drink. I had never seen this man before. Uh-oh, I thought. Our service was about to be tested. My son, he quickly grabbed a cup which was previously used by one of our neighbors. "Get a clean cup," I said. I called out to him from the porch. He opened up the ice bucket, looked in, looked at me. "Daddy, all the ice is melted." The patron, overhearing the child parent overture, told Tom, "That's okay, it's okay. I'll take it warm." He picked up the pitcher of lemonade, that which was left, and poured. And a syrupy ooze came out of the pitcher. "Dad, there isn't enough water," he said. Our customer spoke again. "That's okay. I don't want much. I like it sweet." I hope you do like it sweet, I thought to myself. My son handed the stranger the cup he had ordered. And in return, he gave my daughter a $5 bill. My daughter turned to me. What do I do? She wasn't used to such big bills. She had only 7 nickels in her bowl. I stuck my hand in my pockets. I had 3 $1 bills and a few cents in change. That wouldn't cut it, would it? I'm sorry, I said, we don't have enough. And before I could finish my sentence, the stranger said, that's okay. The kids can keep the change. I smiled. He thanked my children for exceptional service. He climbed back into his car and he drove away from the crossroads of life, never to be seen again. Quite a transaction, I thought to myself. We give this gentleman a warm, partially filled cup of lemonade syrup, and he gives us a compliment and a payment 100 times too much. I had set out to teach my children about free enterprise. They ended up learning a lesson on grace, and so had I. For all the theologizing we preachers do about God's grace, this kind stranger modeled it better than the best sermon can state. And perhaps the story of the stranger who brought grace to the crossroads of life is a good place for us to look at our gospel lesson about the Good Samaritan. For in this story we read in our gospel, it is a story of grace. It's a story about every one of us. So let's take a look at the story. It's one of the most well-known stories and parables in the Bible. In fact, it's so well-known, there isn't a nation or a country in the world that doesn't talk about the Good Samaritan. In our gospel, we find Jesus in a dispute. Once again, he's in a dispute with prominent leaders in Jerusalem who were experts on the law of Moses. What we have pictured in our gospel is a skirmish that would have been typical of the intellectual bantering practiced between the rabbis of Jesus' day. You see, the ancient rabbis tried to bolster the Old Testament law with 613 additional laws. 365, don't do this, and 248, thou shalt do this. So they debated that all the time. The additional commandments were added to interpret to their general rules of life. And part of the intellectual exercise was for them to argue which was the greater and which was the lesser of the laws. For the rabbis, they were not all equal. They were not all important. And their weight became an important issue. How can the spirit of the law be summarized in a few words? And that was the important question. Now, Jesus had most certainly heard this sort of arguing since he was a small child. He was completely familiar with it. And every time he was in the marketplace, every time he was in and about the synagogue, Jesus heard the teachers arguing about the law. Which was more important? Which has greater value? Which one is more important than the other? So it would be not expected that Jesus' response to the lawyer's question would be original. 1,000 others before him had formulated similar responses to the question the lawyer presented to Jesus. Which law is the highest law? What seems original in Jesus' response is that Jesus responds by saying love for one's neighbor is not second to, but equal to love for God. Did you hear that? Love of your neighbor isn't second to, but equal to love for God. Jesus was suggesting that our love for God is not demonstrated in ritual, offering, sacrifice, or obedience to the law, but in flesh and blood encounters with humans whom God created in his image. For Jesus, love of God and love of neighbor cannot be separated. And when one insists upon separating them, both lose credibility. So he tells this parable. And in it, he demonstrates his love. And basically says, unless our lives are gripped by God, we will lose our hold on our intention to love others. Unless we see deeply our need to be forgiven, we will find it hard to forgive someone else. If our lives are empty of adoration and thanksgiving and praise, then we will quickly run out of resources with which to serve our neighbors. Unless there is continuing expression of faith toward God, then loving one's neighbor becomes a shaky enterprise. We love God by neighboring one another, right? Yet rather than having us see ourselves this morning as the hero, as we all like to be, we want to be the Good Samaritan. What would it look like? What would it look like to see ourselves in solidarity with the beaten victim, where Jesus Christ is the Good Samaritan? Let's reinterpret this story for a moment. In my interpretation of this story, Jesus is the one who swoops in and heals us. This man had life-threatening wounds. The gospel says he was half dead. If the Good Samaritan hadn't intervened, this man would have died. What does Jesus do when he sees a soul broken? When he sees a soul bleeding, he completely treats the wound in mercy. Do you hear what I'm saying? And what does my imagination tell me? It tells me the Jericho road is a dangerous road. It's winding and meandering. It starts out in Jerusalem at 1,200 feet above sea level. And by the time it reaches Jericho, just 15 miles away, it falls to 2,200 feet below sea level. 15 miles. In Jesus' time, it was known as the Bloody Path. In our gospel, the first question the priest and the Levite ask. Now, a priest was a lover of worship, a lover of the law, a lover of do's and don'ts and what's right and who's accepted and who's not, who should be brought into the church and who should be thrown away. The Levite, on the other hand, was the one who was pure and didn't want to be undefiled. And so he picks these two people deliberately. And these two stop and they ask themselves, if I stop and help this man, what will happen to me? That's what they respond by saying. The Good Samaritan in our story, on the other hand, reverses the question. If I don't help this man, what will happen? Are you listening to me? Jesus asks a serious question. And it begs the question, do you know why the priest and the Levite don't help? It's the reason we don't help. Uncertainty, fragility, fear. And that uncertainty and fear and fragility can be vicious at times. For them to accept the other was to defame God. So their fear, their uncertainty, their fragility won the day. I can't touch someone of a different nationality. That will defile me. Who is this man? What if he's pretending to be hurt? Fear. Help the other? Help the other? Can any of you this morning relate to the other? Have you ever been othered? Or otherness? Who here today knows about being the other? Church, you got to hear me this morning. Jesus is telling us somebody had to break through and proclaim the living gospel and put themselves in very harm's way. And that's exactly what Jesus does for us, and he does it through this story this morning. Today I tell you, the others in our world are in this dangerous path we call life, where this bloody path to Jericho on finds children at the border being stripped from their parents and living in filthy cages, where Jesus comes and says, no. Out of uncertainty and fragility, we walk by. Where a woman is told by a man she does not have dominion over her own body, but out of fear and popular fame, we remain silent as Jesus gently embraces her and in mercy finds out where she's coming from and what's bringing her to the point where she has to take that action. Where an unarmed black man must fear for those who are supposed to protect and serve us so they don't become part of another shooting of an unarmed man. But because we are a different race, we walk by where Jesus says no to that kind of violence. I'm talking to you, GLBTQ community, where you know what it means to be cast down, where you know what it means to be pushed aside and told we aren't good enough, when we know that we've been fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. Let me tell you a quick story about my dad. Maybe I've told you this story, I don't know, but it's worth repeating 100 times if need be. Who on his very last night of life walked the Jericho Road and spoke words to me that have burned in my memory for the rest of my life. When I came out to my family in 2003, that wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for my family. They knew that I was going to lose my church. They knew that I was probably going to end up in a divorce. I was going to lose my home. They knew the consequences of coming out. And my father never said a word to me about that. He was a civil engineer. And as a structural engineer, the mantra that we always lived by growing up was, my world is black and white. My dad was just a right and wrong person. There was no gray. And he would often say to us, in my world, if something is gray, the building collapses. So it's got to be right, it's got to be wrong. And so that's the mantra we lived by. When I came out, he didn't say a word. For 3 years, didn't say a word about my coming out or losing the church, or when I left the church and went into 911 dispatching for 3 years, which is a story for another day. He never asked me about that job or nothing. But the night he died, or the night before he died, he called us into his room, one by one. Being that I was the youngest, I came into his room last. My sister and brother went in prior to me. I don't know what he said to them, but it's emblazoned what he said to me. And he said to me, Stephen, he said, God is still calling you. And I smirked at my dad, and I said, well, if God's calling me, God has a sixth sense of humor, because I'll never be a pastor again. Dad, I came out. You know that. And he goes, I know. He said, but God is calling you. I said, well, what's God calling me to? And my dad said, he's calling you to this. And I said, what's this? He said, sitting with the dying. It was like a board. It hit me on the side of the head. I thought, of course, that's what I should do. And he says, I want you to go back to school. He said, let me tell you something, Stephen. And I said, I'm not part of the Lutheran Church anymore. They won't accept me. He said, let me tell you something. He said, God had only made a few of people like you. It's not a very big percentage of gay people in the world. He said, I want you to think how unique you are. And he said, I want you to say to yourself how much God must love you to have made you that unique. I've never forgotten that. My dad took a risk, told me how he felt, and as a result, I have a better understanding of who I am. We're told and we're convinced by lies, that we should walk by just because we're different, just because of who we love, just because of what our heart says, that we should not live in the gray of the world or in mercy, but that we should live between right and wrong. And we hear that all the time, which ignores the cry of our God to love neighbor. But here's the good part, church. Here comes the good part. Here's the good news, okay? We know a secret. We know about lemonade, don't we? We need to tell our testimony. Who among us here this morning hasn't seen our ice melt in the sun of July in rejection or in pain? Who of you haven't attempted to serve the best only to find that the best has already been served and that the pitcher we call life needs to be refilled? Who among us here this morning hasn't laid at the crossroads of life, waiting and wondering what God does when what we promise and what we produce aren't even close to being the same? Lemonade stands and living life would be high-risk endeavors if it weren't for the appearance of a gentle stranger who enters our Jericho crossroad of life and picks us up, picks you up, and gives us more than we could ever imagine. For isn't the stranger who became our friend and picked us up on the crossroad of life, looking past our dregs and the remnants of the lemonade we serve and into our hearts? Aren't we much more than surprised children, amazed that we receive 100 times, verily 1,000,000 times more than we could ever ask for? So the next time your calm becomes chaos, think about that. Find yourself reflecting on the lemonade stand. A gentle Samaritan brought you and brought me grace upon grace, not just to our street, but in our very lives. Now go from here and do exactly likewise. Amen? Amen indeed.